No one saw the assassin, but this shy Omega saved the feared Alpha King's life. The palace of Verret rose like a fortress from the misty cliffs, its towers piercing the sky like jagged teeth. From the outside it looked untouchable, serene, and beautiful. Inside it hummed with secrets, whispered fears, and silent power. The halls were wide, lined with tapestries that told stories of kings who had conquered nations and queens who had tamed storms. Yet none of the tapestries could capture the one person everyone in Vereth both feared and obeyed, King Alaric. Alaric was a man of few words and many shadows. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, could pierce through lies, illusions, and even courage. Some said the king could feel fear itself as a scent, and that none dared to meet his gaze for long. Those who did often found themselves trapped in a strange, uncomfortable calm, as if his presence alone could bend the air around them. He was young for a king, but he carried the weight of centuries, passed down not only by blood but by a curse that had haunted his family for generations. The court whispered of the curse in hushed tones. It was said that every king of Vereth was born with fire in their veins, destined to bring both protection and destruction to the land. Some believed the curse made Alaric untouchable, that no one could betray him and live. Others whispered that it made him lonely, because no one could truly approach him without being crushed beneath the weight of his power. And so, the king remained a figure both adored and feared, a living legend. Far away from the thrones and banners, in a quieter wing of the palace, a small figure moved among the stacks of books and scrolls. Elion, an Omega of gentle disposition, was as invisible as he could be. His life had always been one of shadows, careful steps, and quiet observation. The palace staff hardly noticed him, and the nobles often overlooked him. Yet, in this silence, Elion had found his strength. He noticed the details that others ignored: the worn edge of a rug, the faint scent of an approaching storm, the subtle change in a person's voice when they lied. Elion had grown up learning that the world of kings and courtiers was not a place for someone like him. Omegas were often considered fragile, soft, and easily forgotten. He had learned to hide, to bend like reeds in the wind, and to survive unnoticed. But that did not mean he was powerless. In his quiet way, Elion saw more than anyone else could, and he knew more than he dared to speak. The day had started like any other, with the ceremonial preparation of the Great Feast, a yearly event where neighboring kingdoms sent envoys, warriors, and diplomats to solidify peace and alliances. The halls were decorated with golden banners and flickering lanterns, the scent of roasted meats mingling with the smell of polished wood. Musicians played gentle melodies, but underneath the surface, tension rippled like a hidden current. Everyone knew that even the smallest spark could ignite a war. Elion had been assigned to assist in the archives, ensuring the royal scrolls and records were ready for inspection. It was a task that allowed him to remain in the background, out of sight. But as he arranged ancient documents, he felt it, a shift in the air, subtle yet unmistakable. His senses, finely tuned over years of quiet observation, alerted him to danger. Someone was not meant to be here. Not in the grand hall, not during the feast, not in the palace that had been guarded for centuries. He tried to dismiss it at first, thinking it was nerves or imagination. But the feeling persisted, prickling at the base of his neck like icy fingertips. Elion's eyes scanned the room, noting the expressions of the guests, the movements of the guards, the flicker of shadows against the walls. Something was coming, something that could change everything. It happened suddenly. A figure slipped through the crowd like a shadow, moving with impossible speed and silence. The assassin, cloaked and masked, was invisible to all but Elion. His heart hammered in his chest, but he did not panic. Years of hiding, of watching, had prepared him for this moment. He knew what he had to do, though he did not yet know how he would survive it. The assassin's hand darted toward the king, a dagger glinting in the candlelight. In a flash, Elion acted. He rushed forward, intercepting the path without thought. His voice, normally quiet, rang out as he shouted, startling the guards. The blade missed its mark, grazing the air where the king had been standing. But Elion bore the weight of the strike. Pain shot through his arm, sharp and sudden, yet he held fast, pushing the king out of harm's way. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, chairs overturned, and guards scrambled to secure the room. The assassin vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared, leaving nothing but panic in their wake. The king stood frozen for a moment, his stormy eyes wide, but then they found Elian. For the first time in years, Alaric's gaze was not one of command, but of recognition. He saw the Omega who had risked everything to save him, not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of courage. Elian collapsed to the floor, exhaustion and pain overtaking him. The guards rushed forward, lifting him gently, but the king's hand shot out, stopping them. "Leave him," Alaric commanded, his voice low and controlled, yet carrying an authority that silenced the room. "He has done enough for one day." No one spoke for a long moment. The air seemed to hold its breath. Alaric's eyes never left Elian, and Elian, even in weakness, felt the weight of the king's attention as if it were a physical force pressing against his chest. He had never imagined such a thing. All his life he had been invisible, and now the most powerful man in the kingdom was looking at him, not with anger, not with curiosity, but with something entirely new. The healer arrived and tended to Elian, wrapping his wound with careful hands. Pain throbbed, but he barely noticed. He could feel the king's presence like a tether, grounding him in the chaos. For the first time, Elian understood that his life, quiet and hidden though it had been, had intersected with destiny. And perhaps, for the first time, he had a choice. Alaric, meanwhile, stood among the ruins of the feast hall, his mind a storm of thoughts. The assassin's attack had been bold, calculated, and meant to send a message. Yet the one who had saved him was not a knight, not a soldier, not a noble. It was a quiet, timid Omega who had never been seen before. A spark of something unfamiliar stirred within him, a warmth that he had long denied himself. Alaric had spent years mastering control, suppressing emotion, and bending fear into power. But now, something fragile and human had broken through his defenses. The king's advisors whispered around him, their words sharp and urgent, but he barely heard them. His eyes remained on Elian, who now rested in the healer's chamber. He could feel a pull, magnetic and unyielding, toward this small figure who had dared to act where others faltered. The prophecy of his bloodline came to mind, words that spoke of power, of fate, and of the impossible bonds that could change a king's heart. Alaric wondered, for the first time, whether the prophecy might be fulfilled not by violence or fear, but by choice, by someone willing to see him, not as a king, but as a man. Night fell over the palace, painting the towers and walls in shades of silver and shadow. The moonlight spilled across the courtyard, reflecting on the silent fountains and empty balconies. Guards patrolled the corridors, vigilant and tense. But inside the healer's chamber, a quieter drama unfolded. Elian's breathing was steadying, though his eyes remained half-lidded. He had faced death today, and survived. Yet it was not fear that lingered. It was something far more complicated. Curiosity, wonder, and an unspoken question. Why had the king looked at him as he did? Alaric did not leave. He lingered outside the chamber, unheard and unseen by the healer and guards, his presence a silent vow. He could not explain why, but he felt bound to the Omega, as if fate itself had chosen this moment to bend. The weight of the crown, the curse, and the expectations of a kingdom pressed on him. Yet, for the first time, he considered the possibility that power could coexist with something gentler. That strength could be measured not only in conquest, but in courage, and even in kindness. Elian's hand twitched, subconsciously reaching towards something he could not name. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. He did not yet know the meaning of what had happened. He only knew that the world had shifted in one violent instant, and he had been at the center of it. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of the palace, the king understood that the small act of bravery had created a bond that neither could ignore. Outside, the wind howled through the towers, carrying the scent of sea and stone. Shadows danced on the walls, and the palace seemed alive with secrets that were older than memory. In the quiet, a connection had been made. A spark in the darkness, a thread of light winding through shadow. It was fragile, untested, and dangerous, and yet it existed. The King and the Omega, two souls bound by fate, had touched a truth that even the curse could not erase. As dawn approached, the palace stirred with cautious life. The guests whispered, the guards sharpened their senses, and the halls prepared for another day of political intrigue. But somewhere in the quiet chambers a silent understanding hung in the air. The world had changed, even if only slightly, because one shy Omega had dared to act where no one else could, and King Alaric, feared by all, had seen him. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of the palace, painting the stone floors in soft gold. Birds called from the gardens, their songs delicate against the silence of the great hall. But within the walls of Verith, silence was often deceiving. It hid schemes, whispered plots, and the slow, steady pulse of power. Elian woke to the gentle hum of the healer's chamber, the pain in his arm dulled but still present. Sunlight touched his face, warm and calm, yet his mind was restless. He remembered the shadowed figure, the sudden movement, the flash of steel, and the king's eyes. He had expected fear, anger, or disbelief, but Alaric had looked at him with something else. Recognition. Recognition was far more dangerous than fear in a palace like this. The door opened quietly, and the king entered, his presence filling the room in the way a storm fills a valley. Alaric did not speak immediately. He only looked. His eyes, gray and sharp as winter ice, scanned Elian with careful attention. There was a strange softness beneath the storm, a hint of curiosity and something else, something unfamiliar.
"You are awake," Alaric said, his voice steady, controlled.
It held no anger, no command, only observation. Elian nodded, keeping his voice low.
I am well enough, Your Majesty.
The wound is minor. Alaric's gaze did not soften. Minor? His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed concern. That blade was poisoned. Even a small scratch could. He did not finish the thought. He did not have to. Elian understood. For a moment neither spoke. The room was heavy with unspoken words, with thoughts too complex for polite conversation. Elian wanted to shrink back, to hide behind the healer's presence, to remind himself that he was supposed to be invisible. But some part of him, the part that had acted without thought during the attack, felt a pull toward the king that was impossible to ignore.
"You risked yourself for me," Alaric said finally. "That is unusual."
I could not stand by. I saw what was coming. The king's lips pressed into a thin line. For centuries, Alaric had been taught that power was measured by control, by fear, by distance. To have someone act purely from choice, without calculation or duty, it unsettled him. But it also stirred something long buried, the faint possibility of trust. "Come," Alaric said after a pause, stepping aside. "You will remain under my watch until the wound heals." Elian nodded again, unsure if he had heard correctly. Under the king's watch? Normally, Omegas like him were kept away, hidden in corners or sent to safe rooms. The thought of remaining so close to Alaric filled him with both fear and a strange thrill. The day passed with quiet tension. Servants and guards moved carefully around the chamber, unsure how to act around the king's unusual guest. Elian noticed the small things, how Alaric's fingers twitched when he was deep in thought, how the stormy gray of his eyes shifted depending on his mood, and how even a slight movement in the corridor seemed to alert him. The king was always aware, always watching, and always waiting. By afternoon, Elian had been allowed to sit in the sunlight by the window. He watched the palace gardens, where fountains glittered and flowers swayed in the gentle breeze. Yet his attention kept returning to the king, who remained standing nearby, silent and unreadable. "You are quiet," Alaric said, finally breaking the silence. "Do you always observe so carefully?" I notice what others do not. It is safer that way." Alaric's eyes narrowed slightly. not in anger, but in curiosity. Safer?
Yes, Elion said softly.
In this palace, there are many dangers, and I have learned that the smallest details often matter more than the strongest walls. Then you have noticed something others do not. Ilion felt his pulse quicken. Could he speak of the assassin?
Of the threat that had nearly ended the king's life? Or was it safer to remain silent?
After a moment, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. There are those who do not wish you well, he said. Not all threats are obvious. Some wait in shadows. Even when the hall is full of people. Alaric's eyes darkened. He had known this, of course, but hearing it from the Omega, so quietly, so simply, made the danger feel immediate, personal. He had been trained to face enemies with sword and command, but the thought of unseen plots unsettled him.
You are wise, Alaric said, almost to himself.
Then, as if noticing the words, he added, For someone so small, you carry a sharp mind. Elion's cheeks warmed. Compliments from the king were rare, and even rarer when spoken without condescension. For a moment, the healer stepped back, leaving them alone in a quiet, fragile bubble. The king's attention was suddenly drawn to the window, where clouds gathered in the sky. A storm approached, bringing wind and the scent of rain. Alaric did not move, but Elion noticed the tension in his posture, the subtle shift of his fingers. The king's body was always alert, even when he appeared still.
Elion, Alaric said, turning his gaze back to him.
Do you understand what it means to serve a king?
Elion swallowed. I believe it means
To protect, to watch, and to understand, to see what others overlook.
Alaric nodded slowly. Yes.
And yet, not everyone who serves does so willingly. Some act out of fear. Some act for reward. Some act for their own survival. He paused. You acted without thought of reward or fear. That is rare, dangerous, and remarkable. Elion felt his heart beat faster. He had never imagined that someone like him could be called remarkable, let alone by the king of Vareth. Yet the words carried weight, more than flattery. They carried recognition. The storm broke that evening, rain lashing against the palace walls. Lightning illuminated the corridors in sudden flashes, and thunder rolled through the stone halls like a warning. Guards hurried to secure windows and doors, but within the chamber, the king and the Omega remained.
You must stay close, Alaric said, his voice low and serious. The threat is not gone.
The assassin, or whoever sent them, is still at large. Elion nodded. I will do what I can, Your Majesty. Alaric's stormy eyes studied him for a long moment. You will not only protect me, he said quietly, but you may also change the course of what is coming. That is a burden, and one that may cost you more than you know. Elion's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. He understood the weight of the king's words. But despite the fear, a strange determination settled in his chest. He had acted once. He could act again, and perhaps, in doing so, he could shape fate itself, instead of merely surviving it. As night deepened, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Shadows stretched across the walls, curling like fingers, and the storm outside rattled the windows with sudden force. Elion sat by the window, listening to the rain, feeling both small and strangely significant. And then he saw it. A figure moving across the courtyard, barely visible beneath the cloak of rain. Elion's heart leapt. The guards were distracted by the storm. No one else would see this, but Elion did. He understood, with a sinking certainty, that the threat was not gone. The palace was not safe, and the assassin, or whoever was behind the attack, would strike again. He glanced at the king, whose eyes were now fixed on him, sharp and questioning. For the first time, Elion realized that the bond between them was growing, not one of command and submission, but of mutual understanding and trust. Something unspoken connected them, fragile yet unbreakable, and that bond, he knew, could be the key to surviving what was coming. Alaric stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a shadow made of stone. "You see them?" he asked softly. Not as a king commanding, but as a man speaking to another.
Elian nodded, his voice barely audible.
"Yes, someone is watching. Waiting." The king's jaw tightened, and his storm-gray eyes darkened further.
"Then we must be ready."
"And you must be ready too." Blood. Elian swallowed, feeling the weight of the word settle on his shoulders. He had stepped into a world of shadows, danger, and power he had never imagined. And yet, despite fear and uncertainty, he felt a strange courage. He was no longer invisible. The king had seen him, relied on him, and somehow trusted him. And that trust would not be wasted. As the rain lashed against the window, Elian felt the first real connection of his life, a bond of choice, not obligation. A king and an omega, both bound by circumstance, both learning that courage and wisdom could be stronger than swords or fear. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the courtyard. A shadow moved again, silent and swift, and Elian knew, with an icy certainty, that the real danger had only just begun. The storm had passed, leaving the palace drenched in silver light and the scent of wet stone. In the quiet aftermath, life slowly returned to its measured rhythm. Guards patrolled the corridors with sharper eyes. Servants moved cautiously through the halls, and whispers of the recent attack rippled through the court. But inside the chambers where Alaric and Elian now spent most of their time, a different tension hung. One far more dangerous than the storm that had passed. The king of Vareth had always been a figure of control. His every movement, every word, had been sharpened by years of war, prophecy, and expectation. Yet after the attempt on his life, something inside him shifted. Alaric no longer merely observed the world. He felt it differently. The faint warmth he sensed in Elian's presence stirred a quiet defiance in him, one he had not allowed himself in decades. Elian, meanwhile, had grown accustomed to the king's attention. He moved carefully, speaking only when necessary. Yet his quiet presence began to affect Alaric in ways neither fully understood. The Omega had a gift for noticing subtle patterns, and the king, despite all his power, trusted those observations more than he would ever admit aloud. "You are certain the assassin will not strike again immediately?" Alaric asked, his voice low and precise as they walked through the corridors. His storm-gray eyes scanned every corner, every shadow. Elian shook his head. "I cannot be certain, Your Majesty. Whoever sent them, they know the palace well. They will strike when we least expect it."
Alaric's jaw tightened. "Then we must anticipate them."
"And yet," he added softer this time, "there is more I must consider. The curse, it grows stronger." Elian looked up at him, curiosity mingled with concern. "The curse?" "Yes," Alaric said, stopping to lean against the stone wall. His hand rested on the cold surface as if he could steady himself through it. "It has been with my bloodline for generations. Every king of Vareth has carried it. It feeds on isolation, on fear, on the weight of the crown. And each time it grows, it demands more: strength, obedience, solitude, control. It can be broken, but only in ways no one dares to attempt." Elian listened carefully, absorbing each word. His mind raced. The king was not merely fighting enemies outside the palace. He was fighting something within himself, something ancient and unyielding. And perhaps, Elian realized with a quiet shiver, the bond between them might be the only thing that could help him survive. "Then perhaps it is not only the assassin we must watch for," Elian said carefully. "Perhaps the curse itself is part of the danger." Alaric's eyes softened slightly, a rare break in his usually stormy gaze. "Yes," he admitted. "The curse is as dangerous as any blade. It is invisible to most, but it is always present. It shapes my decisions, my anger, my solitude, and it can consume everything if I am not careful." They walked in silence for a while, the echoes of their footsteps mingling with the distant murmur of the palace. The king's confession weighed on Elian, but instead of fear, he felt determination. He had already acted once to protect the king. Perhaps now he could act again, not with strength, but with understanding. With careful observation, with insight. The next few days passed with careful routine. Alaric allowed Elion to remain near him, studying the archives, observing the guards, and learning the patterns of the palace. Elion's quiet attentiveness revealed small inconsistencies, doors left unlocked at night, unusual behavior among some staff, and subtle movements that suggested someone watched them from the shadows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the chambers in gold and crimson, Alaric called Elion to his private study. The room smelled of parchment, candle wax, and the faint hint of rain that had lingered from the last storm. The king's eyes were serious, stormy, and intense, yet there was a faint trace of something else. Trust, perhaps, or need. "You have proven yourself capable," Alaric said, motioning for Elion to sit. "But what comes next may test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." Elion nodded, feeling both fear and resolve. "I will do what is needed, Your Majesty."
Alaric leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished wood.
"The curse does not strike outwardly. It does not appear as fire or shadow. It strikes at the mind, the heart, at the connections we hold. It makes a king fear those closest to him, because attachment is weakness. But," he added, his voice softer, almost a whisper, "it is not weakness. It is choice. And that is why you are here." Elion's pulse quickened. He had felt the pull between them, subtle yet undeniable, but hearing it acknowledged by the king filled him with awe and trepidation.
"I do not understand, Your Majesty," he said.
"You do not need to," Alaric replied. "Not yet. You only need to know this. The curse will challenge both of us. It will try to divide us, to force me into solitude, to make you doubt yourself. But if we stand together, if we act with awareness and courage, it can be overcome." Elion's hands rested on his lap, tight with nervous energy. "I will do my best," he said simply. The king's lips curved faintly, almost a smile. "That will be enough for now." As they spoke, a soft knock sounded at the door. One of the palace guards stepped inside, bowing low. "Your Majesty, a visitor from the neighboring kingdom wishes an audience. He claims urgent matters regarding the recent attack." Alaric's eyes narrowed. "Bring him in." The visitor entered, a man cloaked in fine fabrics and bearing the insignia of a rival kingdom. His eyes flicked to Elion with the faintest trace of suspicion, but he said nothing. The conversation that followed was formal, filled with polite words that masked tension and veiled threats. Elion listened carefully, noting the man's gestures, his glances, and the subtle ways he avoided direct statements. After the visitor left, Alaric turned to Elion, his expression unreadable. "Do you see? Even outside forces sense weakness. They will test me, test this bond, test everything we hold." Elion nodded, though he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The palace, the kingdom, the king himself, all seemed poised on a delicate edge, and one misstep could send everything crashing down. Yet beneath the fear he felt something else, a quiet courage that had grown stronger since the day he saved Alaric's life. Days turned into nights, and nights into a tense rhythm of preparation and observation. Alaric began to rely on Elion more, not only as an observer, but as a companion. The king's usual solitude softened in the presence of the Omega, who spoke little but saw everything. And slowly, the bond between them deepened, fragile yet undeniable. One night, as moonlight spilled across the chambers, Alaric and Elion stood together by the window, looking out over the city. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of the palace subdued by lingering fear. "You do not fear me," Alaric said suddenly, his voice low, almost hesitant. Elion turned, meeting the king's storm-gray eyes. I cannot," he admitted. "Not after what I have seen."
"I know your strength, Your Majesty. I know your power."
"But I also know that you are more than that." Alaric studied him, as if weighing every word, every emotion. "More than that? Yes," Elion said softly. "You are human. You feel. You hope.
You protect. You are complicated.
And I am grateful to be near you. For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then he reached out, placing a hand lightly on the edge of the windowsill, close but not touching Elion. Perhaps you are right, he murmured. Perhaps there is more to a king than the crown and the curse. Perhaps there is choice. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind whispered through the towers, carrying the faint scent of rain and distant smoke. In that moment, the palace felt alive, not with fear, but with quiet possibility. And yet, danger still lurked. Elion's keen eyes caught movement outside, a shadow slipping through the courtyard, silent and deliberate. The assassin, or someone far more cunning, had returned. This time, it was not a simple strike.
It was a test. Elion, Alaric said, his voice steady but sharp. They have returned.
And this time, it will not be simple. Elion felt a chill, but also a strange determination. He had survived once. He had saved the king. And now he would face whatever came next, not out of fear, but out of choice. Together they moved to the door, silent as shadows themselves. The storm of their world was far from over. The curse, the palace intrigue, and the enemy waiting in the darkness would all demand their attention. But for the first time, they faced it not alone. And in the quiet, dangerous moments before the confrontation, the bond between King and Omega had grown strong enough to defy even the shadows that threatened them. The palace courtyard was silent under the pale light of the moon. Rain had left the stones slick and reflective, glimmering like black glass. The air smelled of wet earth and burning torches. Elion's eyes scanned every shadow, every movement, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Beside him, King Alaric stood tall, his storm-gray eyes cutting through the darkness like blades. The figure in the courtyard moved slowly, deliberately. This time, it was not a reckless assassin, but someone who seemed to understand the palace as well as its king did. Their purpose was clear: test Alaric, challenge him, and perhaps break him. "You are ready," Alaric said quietly to Elion, his hand brushing briefly against the Omega's shoulder. There was no fear in his voice, only certainty. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Elion nodded. He had been invisible all his life, watching the world from quiet corners. But tonight, he would no longer hide. Tonight he would stand with the king, not as a servant, but as a partner, as someone whose courage mattered as much as any sword or spell. The shadow moved closer. As it stepped into the torchlight, Elion gasped softly. The figure wore no mask, no armor, but their eyes gleamed with cold intelligence. It was clear they had studied the king, the palace, and the Omega. This was not an ordinary threat. This was a challenge of mind, will, and spirit. "You have grown bold, King of Vareth," the figure said, their voice smooth, calculated. "But the curse is not something you can escape. It will take everything from you, even those you trust." Alaric's jaw tightened. "You underestimate me," he said, his voice low, resonant with power. "The curse does not control me. I control it, and I am not alone."
Elion stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The air was heavy with magic, unspoken tension, and the sense of destiny unfolding.
He realized that the bond between him and the king was stronger than any fear, stronger than any curse. It was built on choice, courage, and understanding. And it was about to be tested. The figure laughed softly, a sound like ice cracking. "We shall see," they said. With a gesture, shadows seemed to twist and move across the courtyard, rising like dark tendrils. The curse of the king was not a simple spell. It was alive, a force that fed on fear, doubt, and isolation. And now it reached outward, seeking to twist the world around Alaric. Alaric did not falter. He stepped forward, drawing energy from the bond he shared with Elion. The storm inside him, the curse that had haunted his family for generations, roared like thunder. But instead of consuming him, it responded to the Omega's presence. Elian's calm, steady courage anchored him, reminding him of the humanity he had feared to embrace.
"You will not take what is mine," Alaric said, voice ringing through the courtyard.
Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating his face, resolute and commanding.
"I am king of Varith, and I am not alone."
Elian stepped beside him.
"And you never will be," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "I am here.
I see you. I choose you." The words carried a power the figure could not touch. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if the strength of connection and trust between the king and Omega pushed them back. Magic and fear met courage and choice, and the balance of the moment shifted. The figure hesitated, realizing the challenge they had underestimated. This was not simply about striking the king down or spreading fear. It was about connection, about trust, about bonds that could not be broken by force. And in that realization, the shadow began to waver. Alaric's storm-gray eyes softened as he looked at Elian.
"Do you understand what this means?" he asked quietly. "This bond,
it can change everything. It can break the curse.
It can remake the kingdom, or destroy it."
Elian nodded.
"I understand," he said, "and I choose to stay with you, whatever comes."
The moment held, electric and fragile. The storm outside mirrored the storm within the courtyard. The clash of magic, power, and will. But the king and Omega were not separate from it. They were the center, the anchor, the force that could reshape fate itself. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric extended his hand toward the figure. "I do not fear you," he said. "I fear nothing that cannot be faced with truth and choice." The figure froze, then slowly lowered their hands. The shadows twisted and collapsed, retreating as if unwilling to touch the bond now visible between the king and Omega. For a long moment silence reigned, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the soft patter of rain from the earlier storm. Elian exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "It's over?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Alaric shook his head slowly, stormy eyes still searching the darkness. "Not entirely," he said. "The danger may return. The kingdom may still face challenges, but the curse, it has been weakened. It can no longer rule me completely, and neither will I allow it to rule you."
Elian's hands trembled slightly, but he held himself steady. "Then we face what comes together," he said softly but firmly.
Alaric looked at him, a storm of emotions crossing his face. Relief, awe, and something more tender, more human than he had allowed himself to feel in years. "Together," he agreed. In the days that followed, the palace began to change. Guards no longer moved with constant fear, servants whispered less about danger, and the halls seemed lighter, freer. The king's presence remained commanding, but there was a new quality to it, strength tempered with understanding, power balanced by choice. And Elian, once invisible and quiet, became a visible, important part of that world, his courage acknowledged by those who had never noticed him before. Alaric and Elian's bond grew stronger, subtle and unspoken at times, but always present. The king, once defined by solitude and fear, discovered the power of connection, and Elian, once defined by invisibility and caution, discovered the power of choice and courage. Together, they reshaped not only their own fates, but the future of the kingdom. The court, initially uncertain of this shift, began to respect the king's decisions in new ways. Nobles who had plotted and whispered in shadow realized that strength was not only in fear and domination, but also in vision, wisdom, and compassion. And the Omega, who had once been overlooked, became a symbol of insight, bravery, and quiet influence. A reminder that courage came in many forms. One evening, as the sun set over the palace towers, painting the skies in gold and crimson, Alaric and Elian stood together on a balcony overlooking the kingdom. The streets were alive with the sound of life, children playing, merchants calling, and the soft laughter of people no longer weighed down by fear. Alaric looked at the Omega beside him, his storm-gray eyes soft but intense. "We have faced much," he said quietly, "and yet I feel something I have not felt before. Peace." Not because the kingdom is safe, but because I am not alone.
Elian smiled faintly. I feel the same, he admitted.
And I know the future will hold challenges. But we will face them together. The king reached out, lightly brushing Elian's hand. It was a gesture of trust, of connection, of recognition that went beyond words or duty. Then let us move forward, Alaric said, his voice steady, not as ruler and servant, but as two who choose to stand together. Elian nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with fire or light, something far deeper, rooted in courage, understanding, and choice. Together, he echoed. And so, under the vast skies of Vareth, with the moonlight reflecting off the palace towers and the distant sea, a new chapter began. The curse that had once haunted generations was broken not by magic alone, but by trust, courage, and connection. The king was strong, yes, but he was human. And the Omega, once invisible, had become indispensable, not through power, but through heart. The kingdom watched, uncertain at first, but slowly hope returned. The story of the shy Omega who had saved the feared king became legend, not one of swords or blood, but of bravery, choice, and the quiet, unyielding strength of human connection. And in the quiet moments when the world seemed still, Alaric and Elian would stand together looking out over a kingdom that was no longer ruled by fear, but guided by courage, wisdom, and the bond they had forged, a bond that could never be broken.